The citation was stuck to my door with so much duct tape it looked like someone was trying to seal a crime scene. $500 fine for excessive noise violation, Thursday, 3:17 a.m., it read in angry red letters that practically screamed off the page. I stood there in my driveway, still holding my car keys from the airport shuttle, genuinely wondering if I was reading this right. Thursday at 3:17 in the morning, I had been 30,000 feet in the air, somewhere over Kansas, flying back from a cybersecurity conference in Seattle. I had the boarding passes, the conference badge still in my laptop bag, and about 50 emails from the event to prove it. Margaret Whitmore had finally lost her mind. Our HOA president had been circling me like a vulture ever since I moved into Maple Ridge Estates 8 months ago. A 42-year-old divorced software engineer apparently didn't fit her vision of the perfect suburban community. Margaret ran our HOA like her own personal dictatorship. She was 63, wore her gray hair in a helmet that could deflect bullets, and had a smile that never reached her eyes. She measured fence heights with a laser level. She had once tried to fine the Johnsons because their daughter's chalk drawings on their own driveway were not approved outdoor art. She counted the number of flowers in people's gardens to ensure they met the odd number requirement she had somehow pushed through in a late-night board meeting. Before becoming HOA president, Margaret had been a mid-level manager at a bank where she'd been quietly let go after multiple harassment complaints. She'd turned her need for control toward our neighborhood, transforming a volunteer position into what she treated like a full-time career. She had business cards made that said Margaret Whitmore, President and Chief Compliance Officer, as if running a homeowners association was equivalent to running a Fortune 500 company. She held office hours in her garage, which she converted into what she called the HOA headquarters, complete with filing cabinets full of violation histories and a whiteboard where she tracked everyone's infractions with color-coded markers. The woman had a particular problem with what she called unattached males in the neighborhood. She said we attracted unsavory elements, lowered the family-friendly atmosphere, and probably ran secret gambling rings in our basements. My basement had a treadmill and boxes of old tax returns, but try explaining that to Margaret. I walked inside and immediately started gathering my evidence. My flight had taken off from Seattle at 11:45 p.m. Wednesday night. I had been sitting in seat 12C next to a woman who spent the entire flight telling me about her grandson's Little League batting average. The plane had landed at 6:20 a.m. Thursday morning. At 3:17 a.m., when this supposed noise violation occurred, I was watching the flight attendant demonstrate how to use a seatbelt I'd buckled 1,000 times before. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. This wasn't just about a $500 fine. Margaret had been systematically harassing anyone who didn't fit her narrow definition of the perfect neighbor. Last month, she tried to implement a dress code for checking mail, claiming that seeing men in basketball shorts was detrimental to children's development. The month before that, she'd proposed a curfew for single adults, arguing we were more likely to engage in late-night activities. She'd even suggested that unmarried residents should pay higher HOA fees because we supposedly used more resources, though she could never explain what resources those were. My smart doorbell had recorded everything from the past week. Wednesday night showed absolutely nothing. No visitors, no lights, no movement. The motion sensors hadn't triggered once between 6 p.m. when my neighbor collected my mail and 7 a.m. when the newspaper hit my driveway. My backyard cameras told the same story of complete inactivity. But here was the interesting part. At 3:05 a.m. Thursday morning, my front door camera had captured Margaret herself, creeping across my lawn with something in her hand. She stood near my living room window for about 4 minutes, then hurried away. At 3:15, there was a brief burst of what sounded like heavy metal music, but it was clearly coming from outside the house, not inside. I enhanced the footage and could see Margaret was carrying a large portable speaker, one of those expensive waterproof ones designed for pool parties. She'd positioned it right against my window, played the music for exactly 2 minutes and 30 seconds, then scurried back toward her house. The really damning part was that she looked directly at my camera at one point, not realizing it had night vision capabilities. Her face was perfectly clear, and she was wearing the same HOA president blazer she wore to every meeting, as if she was conducting official business at 3 in the morning. I downloaded everything onto a flash drive and headed straight to the police station. Officer James Bradley looked at my evidence with raised eyebrows. He said it was obvious I hadn't been home and that Margaret's behavior on the security footage was concerning. He agreed to come with me to confront her. Margaret answered her door wearing her official HOA president blazer, the one with her name embroidered in gold thread that she'd bought with association funds. Her practiced politician smile flickered when she saw Officer Bradley standing beside me. She launched into her prepared speech about maintaining standards and protecting property values. Her voice had that condescending tone she used when explaining why someone's grass was 0.2 inches too tall. She insisted multiple residents had complained about industrial music and shouting from my property. Officer Bradley asked to see her documentation of these complaints. Margaret's face went through several shades of pink as she claimed the complaints had been verbal and she hadn't thought to document them properly in her distress. When I showed Officer Bradley the footage of Margaret on my lawn at 3:05 a.m., her color went from pink to ghost white. She stammered that she had been investigating reports of suspicious activity. Officer Bradley pointed out that according to her own timeline, the noise hadn't started until 3:17. Then I played the audio of the music coming from outside my house. Margaret's hands started trembling as she insisted someone must have been in my yard. When I mentioned my backyard cameras showed nothing, she accused me of tampering with the footage. Officer Bradley asked Margaret if she owned any portable speakers. She said no, then admitted she had one for emergencies, then claimed it had been stolen last week. When he asked if she'd filed a police report for the theft, she said she'd been too busy with HOA duties. That's when Margaret made her mistake. She said that even if I wasn't home, I was still responsible for my property and anyone who might have been there. Then she let slip that she knew I had been at a conference, information I hadn't shared with her. Her face turned purple as she realized what she'd just admitted. She tried to backtrack, claiming she just assumed I was traveling because my car wasn't in the driveway. But Officer Bradley pressed her on how she knew it was specifically a conference. Margaret's story kept changing. First she said she'd overheard it somewhere, then she claimed someone had mentioned it at the grocery store, finally she insisted it was just a lucky guess. But the damage was done. Officer Bradley informed Margaret that filing a false complaint was a crime, and that her actions could constitute harassment. Margaret's carefully maintained composure finally cracked. She started ranting about how single men ruined neighborhoods, how I probably had parties when she wasn't watching, how someone had to maintain order. I recorded her entire meltdown on my phone, including her admission that she'd been monitoring my travel schedule through a friend who worked at the airline. Officer Bradley wrote up a report and told Margaret she would likely face charges. I spent the next 3 days contacting neighbors. The stories poured out. David Park had been fined for a non-existent broken window while he was deployed overseas. The Andersons had received violations for cars that didn't belong to them. Jennifer Santos, another single person, had been cited for inappropriate curtains that were actually the same as Margaret's own. But the worst story came from Robert and Susan Phillips, an elderly couple who'd lived in the neighborhood for 20 years. Margaret had fined them $800 for medical equipment on their porch, which turned out to be Robert's wheelchair ramp. When they tried to explain it was medically necessary, Margaret had told them that illness was no excuse for eyesores. She'd actually suggested they should consider moving to an assisted living facility if they couldn't maintain property standards. Susan broke down crying as she told me this, saying they'd paid the fine out of their fixed income because they were terrified of losing their home. Then there was Marcus Thompson, a veteran who worked nights as an EMT. Margaret had repeatedly fined him for parking his personal vehicle in his own driveway during the day, claiming it violated the spirit of the residential parking guidelines since most people were at work. She'd actually tried to pass a rule that vehicles had to be gone between 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. on weekdays, which would have been impossible for anyone who worked nights or from home. 14 of us hired an attorney named William Hayworth who specialized in HOA law. When he reviewed our evidence, he actually laughed out loud. Margaret had violated numerous state statutes and federal fair housing laws. The emergency HOA meeting was scheduled for Tuesday night. Margaret sent out a newsletter warning about troublemakers trying to destroy our community values, but everyone already knew the truth. The community center was packed. Margaret sat at the head table, gripping her gavel like a weapon. She started with a speech about the burden of leadership and how some people didn't appreciate her sacrifice. William Hayworth stood up and presented his evidence. 23 false complaints over 18 months. A clear pattern of discrimination against unmarried residents. Over $16,000 in fines that couldn't be properly accounted for in the HOA's books. The room exploded. People demanded to know where their money had gone. Someone pointed out that Margaret's nephew had been paid $40,000 for pool maintenance on a pool that didn't exist. Another person mentioned seeing HOA purchase plants in Margaret's personal garden. Margaret banged her gavel so hard it broke. She threatened to fine everyone present for creating a disturbance. That's when I stood up and played the recording of her admitting to stalking my travel schedule and her rant about single men. The board called for an immediate vote to remove her. Margaret screamed that the vote was illegal, but William pointed out that the bylaws allowed emergency removal for criminal conduct. The vote was 58-2. Only Margaret and her friend Eleanor supported keeping her in power. Margaret tried to say she was resigning anyway, but the board insisted on formally removing her. The district attorney filed 18 counts of filing false reports, each carrying potential jail time and fines. The civil lawsuit from 14 families sought $400,000 in damages. Then the state investigation revealed that Margaret had embezzled $43,000 in HOA funds over 2 years. At her criminal trial, Margaret's lawyer argued she suffered from a mental condition that made her obsessed with control. But the prosecutor showed emails where Margaret bragged to her sister about running out the undesirables and making a tidy profit doing it. The prosecutor then presented the most damaging evidence of all. Margaret had kept a secret journal on her computer, which she thought she'd deleted but which the forensic team recovered. In it, she detailed her plan to drive out all single residents, renters, and anyone she deemed unworthy of living in Maple Ridge Estates. She'd written that single men were perverts, single women were loose, and that renters were just trailer trash with temporary money. She'd documented every false complaint with pride, rating them on effectiveness and likelihood of making people move. My noise complaint had gotten 4 stars out of 5, with a note that said should have made it drugs instead, harder to disprove. The prosecutor also revealed that Margaret had been taking kickbacks from her nephew's fake maintenance company. Every time she issued a fine, 30% went into a separate account she thought was hidden. She'd accumulated over $60,000 this way, which she'd used for vacations, jewelry, and ironically, to pay her own mortgage in the very neighborhood she claimed to be protecting. The judge found Margaret guilty on all counts. She was sentenced to 3 years in prison with 18 months to serve, 5 years probation, and ordered to pay full restitution. The fines totaled $36,000. The civil judgment added another $220,000. But the judge wasn't done. He also issued a restraining order preventing Margaret from serving on any HOA board in the state for life. He ordered her to complete 500 hours of community service specifically helping single-parent households, which he noted with deliberate irony. Her real estate license, which she'd kept active for appearances, was revoked by the state board after reviewing the criminal conviction. When the judge announced the sentence, Margaret stood frozen for a full 10 seconds, her mouth open in a silent scream. Then she collapsed into her chair, wailing that she was just trying to keep the neighborhood safe. As the bailiff placed the handcuffs on her wrists, Margaret's carefully styled hair fell across her face and she looked every day of her 63 years as she sobbed that this wasn't supposed to happen to people like her.